A new book, Flying Scotsman in America, the 1970 tour, by Richard Hinchcliffe and Bill Wagner, has just been released by Amberley Publications. The book contains rare photographs of the train's historic and controversial voyage across America, from Texas to Wisconsin and into Canada. The train travelled on the cheapest tracks, called at the smallest towns and the major railroad stations of the Midwest. Pictures in the book show the great interest of ordinary Americans in the train. The book takes you back to the 1970s, when NASA put men on the moon and Alan Pegler took Flying Scotsman to America.
It's a long story, but to cut it short, Alan Pegler, who owned Flying Scotsman, who bought Flying Scotsman in 1963, was president of the Gainsborough Model Railway Society. It's a very large O-gauge model railway in Gainsborough, Lincolnshire. Alan Pegler was a local businessman from Nottinghamshire and a railway enthusiast. Alan was a good benefactor to the Model Railway Society. And my father was one of the founders of the Model Railway Society, founded just after the Second World War. And so that's how they knew each other. In the 1950s, Alan Pegler was involved in restoring the Festiniog Railway. My father was also involved in arranging steam rail tours on British Railways. They would organise one or two every year. And that's how my dad became an organiser of steam railway tours. And at the same time, Alan Pegler was doing a similar thing as well. He used to do it for the employees of his family's factory in Retford, just down the road from Gainsborough. My father was sitting alongside Alan Pegler at the annual dinner of the Gainsborough Model Railway Society, and a hat was being passed around everybody at the dinner in order to raise money to buy Flying Scotsman. And Alan Pegler leaned over to my dad and said, "Don't bother putting any money in, I've already bought it." Alan Pegler gave up his directorship with Northern Rubber. He became what's known as a name on the Lloyd's insurance register. He was a Lloyd's underwriter. At Lloyd's of London, you use your own money to underwrite insurance risks as part of a consortium. So Alan Pegler earned money through that. And of course, he got to know lots of business individuals. He was very well connected in the city. He became famous for owning Flying Scotsman, and he appeared on British television shows like Call My Bluff and Desert Island Discs. And Alan Pegler became a celebrity. So putting together Alan Pegler's charisma alongside the fame of the locomotive seemed to be a good idea. And Alan Pegler was also very aware that, of course, he couldn't drive his engine on British Railways. He had to leave it to British Railways drivers to drive it. And he kind of had a fantasy to follow in the footsteps of King George V, Royal Scot. Flying Scotsman was now really the most famous locomotive in the world. Alan Pegler had an entrepreneurial spirit to create a train of exports that would go over to Britain. It would pay for the locomotive steam around the country in America. They put together an organisation called London Stateside. That organisation began to create things for the American tour. The tour also had two American sponsors. Harold Fuller, who was the president of the National Railway Museum in America, which is situated at Green Bay in Wisconsin. Harold Fuller was also friends with a man who had even more money than Harold Fuller, and that was Nelson Blount. Nelson Blount owned Steamtown, and Nelson Blount and Harold Fuller came over to the UK in 1966, and they went on a Gainsborough Model Railway Society rail tour with my dad and Alan Pegler, hauled by Flying Scotsman. Nelson Blount was going to be a very good friend for Alan Pegler. He had lots of money and he would sponsor the tour in America, and that would kind of underwrite the tour financially. But unfortunately, a year later, flying his own little biplane, he crashed it into a tree and died. So that was the end of Nelson Blount. But nevertheless, the tour still continued to be organised by London Stateside. The date for the tour, I think, was put back to 1969. It was going to be 1968. The tour became controversial because Flying Scotsman was such a popular locomotive in the UK. The big issue really was many people at that time in the 1960s feared that Flying Scotsman wouldn't come back. Such would be the economic gravity of America that the dollars would be something that Alan Pegler wouldn't be able to resist, and plus there was a chance that he could go bankrupt over there and so on. And my dad was a school teacher all of this time that I've been talking about. I mean, it was the organising of rail tours. This was a complete amateur enterprise, although there was so much business with Flying Scotsman. My mother, as my dad's secretary, really these days we'd call her an assistant manager, she was the first person to be employed full-time by Flying Scotsman. She was employed part-time, really, but she was the first person to be employed around about 1966, 1967, just in terms of helping to organise the tours. Yeah, leading up to 1969, my dad was recruited by London Stateside to look after the locomotive's coaling arrangements and the crewing and the maintenance of the locomotive and the train. Because he was well connected in the Lincolnshire Education Authority, he got time out from his career as a school teacher to go on the train. So that's how it happened. So he was responsible for the loading of the locomotive at Liverpool. There is some film of him somewhere where the locomotive was lifted up from the docks at Liverpool to be put onto the ship, onto the Saxonia. He stood underneath it to look to see if the middle big end was in the right position or something. He was just showing off, really. That's the kind of man he was. But he got things done. Anyway, he went over to America as well, of course, followed the locomotive over there. He'd already been over to America previously with Alan Pegler to talk to the railroad authorities over there to make sure that the locomotive would do everything from fit on the tracks to be able to have its maintenance arrangements wherever it was, and to talk about running rights. were issues with the vacuum brake, which were sorted out, but the Americans didn't understand the vacuum brake, and my dad had to explain it to them. And they famously said, "Well, whatever you say, George, it's all right with us." And that's how it came about. Sponsoring railroad authority over there was the Southern Railway, and their president, Graham Claytor, was a big steam fan. They had a few preserved steam locomotives, so they understood the fascination with steam railways. The train was going to travel on a lot of southern tracks from Washington, D.C., all the way down through Atlanta to into Louisiana. So Scotsman was going to travel on a lot of those tracks. So it made sense for them to be a company that would back the tour. So the tour started out in 1969 at Boston, and but by the time they had Baltimore, it was quite clear to everybody on board the train they weren't taking enough money. They weren't able to take enough money on the train, people going through the train. They weren't able to take enough money on the souvenir cars, and the souvenir buses. They'd taken over 2 London double-decker buses over to America. And I don't know if you've ever been on a London double-decker bus, but once you're in there, it can be difficult to get out. And if you're in there buying quite expensive souvenirs, and those souvenirs are being sold to you by attractive young women in tartan miniskirts, because that was the British and kind of the Scottish cultural image that was being bestowed. And if you're a man and a railway enthusiast and you're surrounded by these kind of things, you probably don't want to leave that double-decker bus. And as a result, they didn't sell many souvenirs. And the company that was behind the souvenirs, the person who was in charge of that disappeared. They did a runner because they couldn't pay for the young women's hotel bills. So Alan Pegler stepped in and said, "Well, I'll pay for it all." They sent a lot of people home in order to reduce their costs. Basically sacked them, really. Alan Pegler said to my father, "Can you take over the full managership of the whole train now?" And my dad said, "Yes, but I need to bring my wife over as assistant manager. And we have to bring our son as well." So that's how I came to be over there. And my mum and I flew out from Heathrow in, it would have been November 1969. And we flew to Washington. We'd never been in an aeroplane before. And we joined the train. And the first job that my mum got was to be in charge of 15 or 16 mini-skirted young women. So the train started in Boston, moved down the eastern seaboard, Hartford, Connecticut, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. And then that's the section that I remember from Washington down to Atlanta. We must have stopped somewhere else between there, probably Greensboro or somewhere like that in Virginia. But that route down the east side of the United States through the Appalachian Mountains, that was quite spectacular. Going over trestle viaducts with an LNER, Pacific locomotive, British, going over trestle viaducts. It's such a cultural difference between the UK infrastructure and that's in America. It's quite extraordinary. So amazing landscapes to go through. Got down to Atlanta, and at Atlanta there was planned a steamerama, it was called, to take place at Anniston between Atlanta and Birmingham. So when the train finished exhibiting at Atlanta, we met 2 other steam trains, one that came from Birmingham and another one that followed us from Atlanta. And I travelled on that one with a giant 282 locomotive. Then from Birmingham, we went to Shreveport, Louisiana, then on to Dallas and Fort Worth, and then down to Houston, where the tour ended. Lots of members of the crew at Houston. We went out to see the preparations for Apollo 12. And he had this amazing contrast then between Flying Scotsman, 1920s steam locomotive, and then down the road they were preparing at NASA headquarters for the blast off of Apollo 12 from Cape Kennedy in Florida. So it was an amazing time to be in America, especially with the British steam engine. Well, Dad stayed behind and made sure that the locomotive then was moved up along with the carriages to Slayton in Texas, to the old Santa Fe Roundhouse, just outside of Lubbock. That's a journey of about 500 odd miles, so it's quite some distance. But that's where the train was stored over the winter, and then preparations would be made for another tour, and it wasn't quite clear where that other tour was going, but it was probably going to go up the Midwest, although there were discussions that they'd head over to the West Coast. And the idea was that somehow or other they'd put everything right that they got wrong on the first tour, and that the train would make enough money to be able to pay for itself, to make its way back to Britain.
As I said earlier, I grew up in Illinois, which is a long ways from Texas, and I was part of a railway club, model rail historical society. We had quite a few members in the little town that I lived in. It was a very active rail fanning type place. The head honcho, so to speak, was Jim Boyd, who's maybe your readers, listeners, viewers may know. He wrote a lot of books in the United States, edited magazines. He was a very, very well-known photographer. He died 12 years ago, I guess now. Anyway, he was the head honcho there, and he somehow got in touch with Alan Pegler. I have no idea how. And the club acquired a third of a car of space on the exhibition train to put in an exhibit. So we got together and created this exhibit, called it the Rail Fan, kind of showed what we do in chasing trains. So a lot of photographs, historical posters, builder's plates, dinnerware, all the kind of stuff that you might do. We did a little model diorama to show modeling, that aspect. Anyway, it was a third of a car's worth of stuff. This was in Illinois, like I said, and the train was in Slayton, Texas for the winter, which is like 1,200 miles away. I was a college student at the time, and I didn't have a job for the summer. A buddy of mine from high school was an unemployed carpenter as well, so we decided we'd volunteer to drive the car down to Slayton, to take my car down to Slayton with the exhibit and install it. So that's kind of how I got there. It was very accidental, just because I didn't have a job, I did it. My friend Randy and I were both broke that summer, so we figured we'd hang around the train as long as we could. And eventually we started running odd jobs for people, and the crew was nice enough to kind of accept us. We did a lot of work for them. And so they started slipping us a few dollars here and there for gas money and food money and this, that, the other. We were selling our blood, and we did all kinds of stuff to be able to stay with the train. But we just hung out as long as we could, and we managed to scrape up enough money through the summer to stay with it, and stayed with it the whole way. We were installing the exhibit. We got there a week before the train was supposed to leave, and they're just getting the train all ready to go. So all the crew from the UK were there. They were tidying up the train and getting exhibits ready and so forth. So we were just part of the gang that way, so to speak, putting the exhibit in. So as we did that, we were obviously the youngest people there, strong backs, weak minds. And we just did a lot of stuff for them that they didn't want to do or couldn't do. Lift this, haul that, tote this. I had a car, so we could take them back and forth to the hotel where they were staying. We were sleeping on the train, which was great fun in the Texas heat. So we do that and get them lunches from the local cafe and so forth. We just did odd jobs, and we got along well with them. They were very friendly. I guess we were too. And So again, we just did that. By the time the train started, the real work on the train as it toured the country was we pulled into a station stop, maybe in the middle of the day, maybe for the night, but put up the exhibits and let people come through, sell tickets, and people go through the train. So again, all the heavy lifting stuff, we put up the stairs and the flags and the souvenir tables, sold souvenirs. That was probably the big thing. There was, especially in the small towns, just tons of people wanting to buy souvenirs. So we're selling souvenirs back and forth and just general tour guides. And it was an odd job. We'd do it. It ended up in Texas, either Houston or Dallas. I'm not sure which. But that was a totally different tour. It was organized differently. The British government was supporting it, so there was a lot more money to go around with it. They had a lot more people on the UK staff. So again, I was not part of it then. This is just kind of know what I know from hearsay. I did chase it from Atlanta to Birmingham. That was my only association with Flying Scotsman then. I'd never heard of the train before it came over. It was just word came out in the rail fanning type circles that this British steam engine was coming to the States. How cool. So I figured I kind of had to do that and managed to get down to Atlanta and chased it with some friends from there to day long into Birmingham. It's my first airplane trip, by the way. I flew from Illinois to Atlanta, first time. The weather was a bit dicey, but no, it was fine. It was interesting, very well done. There were two other steam locomotives running at the same time. So the train went from Atlanta to Birmingham. Anniston, Alabama is right about in the halfway point. So as a Flying Scotsman went from Atlanta to Anniston, a fan trip, a steam-powered rail fan trip, went along with it, and they could leapfrog each other. So we could stop and take pictures. The people on the fan trip would get off, Flying Scotsman would go running by. They just leapfrogged all the way to Anniston. And at Anniston, another train that had left Birmingham, fan trip, steam engine, met them there. So in Anniston, there were 3 steam locomotives, all under steam, all at the same time, lined up next to each other. They had a whistleblowing contest, which was quite fascinating, with the deep American whistles and the peanut whistle on Flying Scotsman. Quite a juxtaposition. And anyway, from Anniston, the train from Atlanta turned around and went back to Atlanta. The train from Birmingham went back to Birmingham, playing leapfrog with us all the way from Anniston back to Birmingham. It was a trip unlike any other. I've never seen anything like it before or since. the train had spent the winter in Slayton. It was Alan Pegler had somehow gotten permission to use the Santa Fe's roundhouse there, that was the only use for it. It was torn down about a year later. Flying Scotsman was the last engine in it, but they spent the winter there and went from there eventually to Niagara Falls. Again, it was a three month run, 3,400 miles ish all told. The main stops, I guess, the big cities were Dallas, Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, Green Bay. We spent about a month in Green Bay at the National Museum up there, Railway Museum up there, and then Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and ended in Niagara Falls. And Jim Boyd and some of the other members of our club had come down to Mexico, Missouri, to chase the train to St. Louis and photograph it. Well, Jim saw the red pilot and was kind of appalled by that. So he managed to talk Alan Pegler into this would be a good idea to paint it black. Well, Pegler didn't. He was kind of okay with the idea. He didn't want his crew doing it. So this was fine. Boyd said, "Fine, we'll bring down our own people. We'll paint it for you." And that's what happened. So in St. Louis one morning, in the depths of the station, half a dozen folks from the club up in Illinois came down and they scoped it all out, painted the pilot black, and it looked wonderful after that. It was vastly improved, in my opinion, at least. It looked English. Before, with the red pilot, it just, to me, it was kind of garish. It's not, when you see it, that's the first thing you'd see. That's not the way an English steam engine is supposed to look, as far as I can tell. And this, when it was black, it blended in with everything else, so it looked like a normal train would have in England. It was an entity in itself. They didn't sell tickets. I guess it turned out later that they could have, but there was Pegler thought that there was some injunction against selling tickets on the train. So the only people that rode it were the crew and invited guests like newspapermen and things like that. So there was an opportunity to make money that didn't happen, unfortunately. I had a car, so we were driving and chasing it all the way from Slayton to Niagara Falls. So the photography viewpoint, we had the full gamut, all the way from the West Texas rolling hills and mesas and buttes through the farmlands up into Canada. It was kind of everything. We rented a plane one day and chased it from the air. Just all kinds of interesting opportunities. It ran at night one time. It was one night run from Chicago to South Bend. I rode that one, actually. We managed to shuffle cars and managed to be able to actually ride the train. But it was fascinating at night. And of course, there was a corridor tender, so you could go back and forth from the locomotive to the end of the train. And normally you couldn't. You had to be an authorized person to be riding in the cab. But at night, nobody could see us. Nobody cared. So my friend and I, we just took turns going up to the cab, and we rode the cab of the Flying Scotsman all night from Chicago to South Bend. It was fascinating. We had learned how to be firemen, sort of, kind of, a little bit in Green Bay when the train was there for a month. There was a tour train, an exhibit train that ran around the grounds. They didn't have anybody to run it, steam engine, Lake Superior and Ishpeming consolidation. They didn't have anybody to run it, so the Flying Scotsman crew, the drivers, they volunteered. They were bored silly being in Green Bay. The firemen had gone home, so they needed a fireman. So they kind of taught me and my friend Randy and Richard Hinchcliffe, who's the other author of the book. They kind of taught us to be pseudo firemen. So we fired the engine around the tracks at the museum. Well, as long as we're on the Flying Scotsman, I may as well pitch some shovelfuls of coal into the hopper there. So we're going from Chicago to South Bend, and I'm firing Flying Scotsman in the middle of the night. It was just great fun. It looked like, in the countryside around there, it looked like it was kind of nice, interesting countryside farmland. Again, we've been there for a month, so we kind of knew the area. And it looked like it'd be interesting to chase it from the air. Why not? So we ended up just renting an airplane, a pilot, of course. And we chased it for an hour or so by air from Green Bay south, and turned around and went back to Green Bay, got the car and chased it down to Milwaukee. Why not? I had a Honeywell Pentax H1A. Pretty much everybody in our group used that. Jim Boyd, again, the name keeps reappearing. That was his favorite camera, so of course everybody had to copy what Jim did. If Jim thought it was a good idea, it was a good idea. So we all had Honeywell Pentax H1As. We had a telephoto lens and a wide angle lens, things like that to go with it. But that was the basic camera. I still have it. It's right now it's on display in Slayton, Texas, at the museum there at the Harvey House, which is where the train started the tour. So there's a lot of interest in Slayton because of that, the history they had with Flying Scotsman. And a gentleman up there at the museum got in touch with me a couple of years ago, I guess now, and arranged to have an exhibit of all of the souvenirs that I'd kept from there, and the camera's part of it. So there it is. If I didn't know it, I guess is the best way to phrase it. The ones that I do know, Mike Schaefer is the other big name from railroads around these parts. He was part of the group as well. We've known each other since high school. And like Jim Boyd, he's written many books and edited many magazines and articles up the wazoo, and a very well-known photographer as well. Emery Goulash, who I marginally knew, was with the train for quite a ways. Richard Hinchcliffe, George's son, chased with him a lot. I don't know how far he was with the train, but he was another fairly well-known name. If there was anybody else, I wouldn't have known it. It was just as you chase, there's other cars there sometime where you stop and you might wave and say hi, but in general you don't. You're just focused on getting the shot that you want and getting back in the car and heading out again. Richard Hinchcliffe got in touch with me. I forgot who got in touch with who a few years ago, and again, he being in the UK is keenly aware of this is the 100th anniversary of the 100th birthday, so to speak, of Flying Scotsman. So as we got to talking back and forth, it was his idea to write a book. I said, well, fine, I have pictures all over the place. Let's do it. So we kind of did. I mean, why not? We had the material there. I got pictures for the entire 1970 summer. I had actually made notes that summer, so I could tie dates and times and background personal things to various places on the trip and link them with photographs. So it worked out really well. We had a way to document things. And Richard they set up with the publisher and got somebody over there, and we just went from there. We started writing probably in January last year, and we had to get the final draft to them in June. So it took, again, he's in the UK, I'm here. So we met just like we're doing right now on Zoom. And I was sending pictures back and forth, and okay, here's some ideas for captions, and here's how we sequence them. And I had hundreds and hundreds of pictures. You had to pick out 180. So the book is very much it's a specific format. It's 96 pages. It's 180 photographs. It's a 2,000 word introduction and a limit of 120 words per caption. It's cookbook. So, okay, how do we winnow down the slides to 180 that we want? In some sequence, it tells a story through there. And then how can you tell a story in 180 words per caption? It was a non-trivial exercise that way, but again, just great fun. We just bat around ideas and it worked out. I think, well, I'd like to think yes, but a lot of it's in the book. The book is pictures of the Flying Scotsman, photographs for the summer, but it's also about the personalities on the train. We knew everybody, so there's the English, the drivers and their history. The locomotive inspector had been part of the group that recreated the Flying Scotsman nonstop run from London to Edinburgh. Richard's father, George Hinchcliffe, was a very well-known English rail fan type person, so everybody knows him. He was the general manager of the tour, so I got to know him very personally and very well. Alan Pegler, of course, was quite the character. It was a summer full of meeting people and again, it's not just railroads, it's the people that are involved with it, which is, I think, kind of unusual for a railroad. A lot of places in the States, it's easy to chase steam trains. The tracks and the roads run parallel. Other places, not so much. In Illinois, for example, there's a lot of rail fans because of Chicago, the major rail center for trains coming in from every direction. So there were a lot of people up there, but the route that it was on was difficult to chase, so there weren't all that many. A lot of it was people coming to see it when it was stopped, which to me is a different dynamic. So you'd see, especially in the small towns through the South, through Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri, most of the population of the town would come out to see it. So are there rail fans buried in that? Sure. So it's hard to know. There were a lot of people at my track side all the way through. And I rode the train several days. My friend would drive the car and I'd ride, or he'd ride and I'd drive the car sometimes. So yeah, as the train's going along, you're waving at people out constantly. They were just by track side everywhere you went. Again, the smaller the town, the more people showed up. You get to Chicago and nobody cares. It's Chicago. So that was something else that I think is very different in the UK than in the US. My impression is that the Flying Scotsman crew assumed that the big crowds had come out in the big cities, which they must do in the UK. In reality, that's not the way it works here. It was the small towns that I would pull up. There were several places that we stopped almost by accident. Someone comes by and say, hey, would you stop here for an hour? Sure, why not? So the train stops for an hour. And the entire population of the town cycles through it. So you're selling tickets and souvenirs, and people are having a grand time. But it's the biggest thing to happen in that town as opposed to the 500th biggest thing to happen in Chicago. A visitor's viewpoint, the biggest stop we had, we were at the Canadian National Exposition in Toronto, which is like a World's Fair type thing. It's held every year. It lasts for a month or so. Anyway, we were there for the whole time for that. It's a gigantic permanent facility. I mean, there's buildings. It is a big deal in Canada, but we had to be on a track, and the track was nowhere near the main buildings. It was kind of off in the middle of nowhere. So we didn't get gigantic crowds there, although there were gigantic crowds at the exposition. We were just off to the side through nobody's fault. I mean, that's where the track was. So yeah, we got some people through there, but again, not like a small town. We would have been far better off, I think, just going from small town to small town to small town.
a key factor, I think, what a lot of people, when they're talking about why Alan Pegler, didn't cut his losses and take the locomotive back straight away, a lot of people have ignored the fact, or not known of the fact, that Alan Pegler was just having the most tremendous fun that you could possibly imagine. For a late middle-aged American, late middle-aged British, raconteur, really, you'd say somebody like Alan Pegler was. He was enjoying driving his steam locomotive in America, because the footplate crew and the American footplate crew who were on as inspectors would say, well, it's your locomotive, you might as well drive it. And drive it he did. And of course, he couldn't drive it all the time. And we had British crews out there driving the engine, but he was having just such a good time. He was just all over his engine. So we really enjoyed himself. Well, that was great fun. The 1970 tour was a much cheaper affair. We still had quite a crew. We had publicity people. We had 2 train managers. We had volunteer workers who came for a working holiday. And in a sense, Bill, who you're going to interview on Friday, he was kind of doing that, but they weren't kind of recruited by the train. My mum and dad recruited people to have working holidays on the train from the UK. So they would work on the train for their expenses and a small wage, I think. And they recruited them through their network with the Gainsborough Model Railway Society. So there was the 2 train managers were recruited like that, and then other people like Davina Flint. She would have been, I suppose you would have said, she was Alan Pegler's personal secretary. She was recruited from the first tour. She was one of those mini-skirted young women who were selling souvenirs. But Davina was much more management material. She was she is a lovely lady. And the key thing was, instead of being a small exhibit in a very large town, like we were in Washington or New York, the idea of the 1970 tour was that you would also exhibit in small towns along the way, and you would be a big event in a small town. And by and large, where we did manage to exhibit in small places, then it was a great success. On the way through Texas, before we got to Waco, there was a moment when the train had to stop in a loop to let a freight train go by, and we're going to be stopped there for about 2 hours. And my dad struck up a conversation with a guy who was just sitting on a wall opposite the train. And my dad said, do you know anywhere we can get water? And he said, yeah, I'm a volunteer fireman. I'll just call them up and get them over. And he had a walkie-talkie. And the fire crew went on. My dad said, well, that's great. We're going to be here a couple of hours. It would be great if people in this small town could come and look through the train. And the guy said, well, I run the local radio station, so I'll just tell everybody now. And which is what he did. And within, half an hour, there was about 300 or 400 people going through the train. It was kind of combination of American can-do, that can-do attitude, and just the sheer improvisation of being able to do such a thing. Those are the kind of things that happened. From Slayton in Texas down to Temple and Troy, then up towards Waco. Waco, the train was put through down the wrong siding and was derailed. And there was quite a fuss about that. Then from Waco, went on to Dallas, and then up to Muskogee, and then through to Kansas City. From Kansas City across to St. Louis up to Chicago, Chicago, Green Bay. Well, the Canada mission wasn't formalized and set out really until we'd been in Green Bay for some time. We were in Green Bay for about 6 weeks. We had to drop off one of the Pullman cars there because that was promised to the National Railroad Museum as part of their bequest from Britain, from British Railway Museum, I think, because one of those Pullman cars was used by Eisenhower during the Second World War, and the museum at Green Bay had Dwight D. Eisenhower, the A4 locomotive there at the same time, so they were putting those things together. But yeah, the tour through to Canada, went through Sarnia and then up to Toronto, and then to Montreal and Ottawa, and back down through Toronto to the side of Lake Erie, and then finishing up at Niagara Falls. So the main event on the Canadian tour was to exhibit at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. I think we were there for at least 2 weeks. Yeah, it was another opportunity to exhibit the train. Sometimes there were quite a few people on the train. Sometimes, visitor figures were down quite a bit. We needed to earn more money by then. By then, some people had been sent home from the 1970 tour. So already there'd been issues. In fact, some people had gone back at Chicago before we even got to Green Bay. So all of that is detailed in the book. But the Canadian National Exhibition, that was a really good opportunity to perhaps earn a bit more money. By then we were selling footplate rides. The train would trundle along the track for about 200 yards and come back again. And if you had a ride on the footplate, I think it cost you $1 or maybe even $5. Bill tells the story of because the Canadian National Exhibition had a big circus there. Bill tells the story that my dad tried to pull a publicity stunt of having an elephant pull the locomotive. But I can't remember anything about that. But, because I was only 13 years old, those kind of scandalous activities were kept away from me. Perhaps, I don't know. Can't remember. Quite desperate by then in terms of keeping everybody on the train, which is why there were a few members of staff left on the train by the time we got to Niagara Falls. And then my dad stayed behind again to look after the locomotive with the locomotive crew. It was then spent time in Spadina Roundhouse in Toronto. My mum and I came back to the UK, and Dad came back about a few weeks later. And then my dad and Alan Pegler were trying to raise more money back in the UK. Alan Pegler arranged to have a meeting with the Board of Trade in the UK to see, because the Wilson government, the Labour government of Great Britain in the 1960s, backed the Flying Scotsman tour and gave it some money. Didn't give it all its money, but they gave some money to it in order to, because it was British exporters were exhibiting on the train, and the British exporters themselves did very well out of the tour. They got a lot of orders for exporting to America. Other than them paying for the space on the train, it didn't give the train a regular income. And those exporters dried up without that government backing, although some of them were on the 1970 tour. But after 1970, there was no government backing because the government had changed. It was Ted Heath's Conservative government. And the Tories were, or rather Ted Heath himself, had a vision of Britain as much more modern, as a modernized nation. And when the Americans were going to the moon, the idea of going over to America with a British steam locomotive just you can imagine, you can see why they didn't really want to give it all of that backing. But my dad and Alan Pegler had a meeting with the Board of Trade in London, and a Board of Trade official said in the corridor to Alan Pegler and my dad, "Get yourself over to San Francisco and we'll see what we can do. And we'll find you sponsors." So they took that as a go-ahead to take a scratch crew, drive the locomotive and the train over from Canada right across the United States to San Francisco and exhibit there for British Week. British Week was going to be a big celebration of British culture and British exports in San Francisco, because when the train got there, there was no backing from the government and it was all a bit of a damp squib, really. So that tour was much more makeshift. They didn't exhibit on the way over to, or they exhibited very rarely on the way over to San Francisco. When they got to San Francisco, they had a berth at Fisherman's Wharf. Takings on the train were quite good, but unfortunately they were taking up a lot of car parking spaces in front of a load of restaurants, and the restaurants complained and the train was moved 250 yards down the road, and then no tourists came to go through the train, and the train started losing money hand over fist, and within a few months it was clear that the situation was fairly desperate. Alan Pegler had some meetings with a lot of people in San Francisco in order to try and get money put into Flying Scotsman as an exhibit. They were running tours up and down the Embarcadero at San Francisco in order to sell tickets and, make some money that way. But a steam locomotive is basically a great lump of metal that just eats money wherever you have it in the world. And it's extremely difficult to make any money out of an operation like that when you're miles and miles away from home. And my mum, dad, Alan Pegler, and Penny Pegler were all staying in a flat on Leavenworth Avenue in San Francisco. And for several months, they kept the train going basically on its own. So on their own. They did have help from an American millionaire who came over, who was a California millionaire, and he put together a business plan and actually took over running of the train at one point. And but that didn't work out, and he, like many other saviors of Flying Scotsman, kind of disappeared. It was quite clear that the train couldn't carry on. And because of Alan Pegler's connections, and this is a very strange part of the Alan Pegler story, really, because of Alan Pegler's connections, he was able to get the locomotive stored in an army base near Oakland. And once my dad had got the locomotive safely situated there, then he came back home. Alan Pegler had already come home. Alan Pegler came home and declared himself bankrupt in Britain. And my dad went back to got a job, because I was a bit older by then. This was 1972. And I was helping my dad to build model railway locomotives. We had a kind of a company together. So my dad was a model maker, as well as a school teacher, as well as a steam railway heritage, person. So he and I would build O-gauge railway electric locomotives and sell them to model makers, sell them to model railway enthusiasts. So we did that for a few months before he was asked to go and rescue the locomotive. I remember that we were working on a particular model locomotive. We were up in the attic in his workshop, and the telephone rang, and it was Bill McAlpine. Bill McAlpine asked my father to go and see what he could do with the locomotive, negotiate with the creditors, and if possible, to arrange to bring the locomotive back. He met the creditors in America. He didn't meet all of the creditors, but he'd probably met about 3/4 of them. So we owed a lot of money. There was still a lot of money outstanding to the Southern Railway, who, if you remember, were underwriting the tour. I don't know exactly which creditors were there, but they were represented by a lawyer. And my dad said, well, we'll give you half the money. And they said, yeah, all right. Because there were these other creditors who weren't represented at that meeting, my dad had to tiptoe about getting the locomotive out. They'd made lots of friends in San Francisco, and some of those friends in San Francisco, probably all of those friends that they'd met in San Francisco, they all need a big help of thanks, really, a big vote of thanks, helping to get the locomotive out of the army base and into San Francisco. And it was only by luck, really, that my father had found a ship to get the engine back to the UK. As he was flying back from the creditors' meeting, which had taken place in New York, I think, he was sat next to a guy who was a shipping agent, and they had a ship in Oakland or in San Francisco, and it was going to come back to the UK. And my dad received a phone call in his hotel room from this guy. Said, well, we're ready to go. If you get the engine there, we'll put it on board and off you go. So, and that's kind of what happened. And Dad was trying to do that while avoiding any kind of publicity in case all of these creditors, these other creditors, came creeping along. And the story is that you can't smuggle a big green British steam locomotive out through San Francisco without somebody saying, "Hey, there's a big British green steam locomotive." And somebody in the local press did get to know about it. But my father said they plied him with drink, and before they could actually publish anything, the locomotive was on the ship and out in international waters.